are salespeople becoming irrelevant? I mean, how do we stay relevant? And perhaps more so, how do we make an impact on our number if so much is out of our control and relying upon the organisation getting its, I guess, methodology together around that sales process? Hi, my name's Steve Ludlow, curator of the Harlow Group Sales Leadership blog. Today I have with me Graham Hawkins. Thanks for joining us today, Graham.
Pleasure, Steve. Thank you.
Graham's an author of 2 sales books. Most recent one is The Future of the Sales Profession.
Yep.
So for those that don't know Graham's got 28 years sales leadership experience, predominantly in the tech space.
Yep.
Author of 2 books, as we've just said. Recently completed an MBA and actually doing some lecturing at the RMIT, I believe.
That's correct.
What are you lecturing on at the moment?
Yeah, look, a range of sales and marketing based topics, particularly focused around procurement.
Okay.
So, and the changes that we're seeing there.
Okay, from a sales point of view or procurement?
Yes, from a sales point of view.
Okay, fantastic, interesting.
Yep.
For those that don't know, Graham actually was the keynote speaker at the Sales Masterminds event that Harlow Group, along with LinkedIn and Salesforce, sponsored earlier on in the week, which is what's brought us together today.
Yes.
Fantastic keynote.
Good.
I picked up a lot from it. I think you said, how would you have picked up a lot from it? I've heard a lot of content in this space, but there really was quite a bit that I picked up from it. And I think the first thing that really stood out to me is the concept you were speaking about with regard to Accenture's studies, where they've discovered that amongst the sort of enterprise market, there's a lot of vendor rationalisation going on.
Yeah.
And you spoke a lot about tier 2 and tier 3 vendors being pretty vulnerable in that environment and perhaps needing to qualify in or out opportunities based upon this vendor rationalisation, I guess, movement. How are second and third tier vendors, supposed to, you spoke about qualifying them in or out, but do we just give up on that sort of enterprise market and go for tier 2 and tier 3 clients, or how do you perceive that we should be managing that as specialist providers in the market?
Yeah, look, it's a really good question. The first thing we have to acknowledge is that everybody's looking to try and do more business with less vendors. So rationalisation of vendors is real. Everyone's trying to drive cost out of their businesses, and managing vast sums of vendors can be extremely time consuming and costly. So every business on the planet is now trying to arrange their vendors into a vendor stack that's efficient.
Okay.
And so if you're a vendor salesperson and making the assumption that everybody can buy from you, think again.
Okay.
Because in many cases your territory is not as big as you think it is. During the research phase of writing the book, Steve, I interviewed a lot of buyers, and lots of them now put in place a policy for, in fact, blocking off-panel purchases. So in other words, if you're not already on the panel, you'll never get on the panel because they've got the door shut, basically.
Sure.
So as a salesperson, if you don't qualify that really, really quickly, you can spin your wheels in an account for 18 months, only to find right at the end of the sales process, when you're just about to get over the line and get an order, that someone says, no, sorry, we've blocked off-panel purchases.
Sure.
So to your question, if you're a tier 2 or a tier 3 vendor looking to try and get into a new account, then you need to quickly find out if they have got that kind of policy in place.
Yeah.
If you're a tier 3 vendor, a single product vendor, then you need to work out who the prime vendors are, or the tier 1s, and possibly align yourself with one of those as a channel into the account. Now, you mentioned the Accenture Procurement Report 2016. What they found, the key finding really was simply that all businesses will align themselves with a small number of strategic suppliers in order to reduce risk and to reduce cost.
Sure.
So, this is a very real challenge now for the modern vendor salesperson, is how do you find, or how do you identify which accounts to go after, and how do you make sure you're not wasting your time on ones where the door is locked?
Yeah. So as a specialist provider, if you currently have a direct-to-market strategy and you're a salesperson or a sales leader working within that function without the ability to remodel a go-to-market strategy to start partnering with the IBMs of the world or Fujitsu's or whatever that might look like.
Yep.
Is, in your view, in the tech space at
Yep.
least, would it make more sense for these organisations to sort of reframe who they're going after and look at the profile of the typical tier 1 enterprise that's looking at this vendor rationalisation, and perhaps go after the mid-market instead, where they're still looking at innovating and expanding upon the way that they do business so as that they can challenge the tier 1s. hence looking at new vendors to partner with in order to get a competitive advantage.
Yes, 100%. Look, in every facet of go-to-market planning, we are being forced to get more sophisticated and more targeted.
Yeah.
I think everyone agrees. So when you sit down and you do your target addressable market, your market sizing, and you're looking at your segmentation plan, you do your buyer personas, you follow that up with your ideal customer profile.
Yep.
All of that needs to be very sophisticated now. You can no longer afford to just go scattergun or spray and pray, as I call it.
Yeah.
Those days are over. So to your point, we have to get very, very focused on which segments, which target customers, which buyers are our ideal sweet spot type buyers, and qualify them very, very hard. I said to a client of mine recently who was really just a very reactive vendor responding to everything that came along, every proposal. I said, look, if you haven't got a very clear view of the buyer and all of the potential opportunities that you have to sell to that customer, you need to qualify out and walk away. Strategically withdraw, I call it.
Yeah, okay, that makes sense. You've got to work out, I guess, where you're most competitive as well. Just to be in the race isn't enough. You need to know that you're going to be in that top two.
Correct.
with a significant point of difference.
Correct.
We hear it a lot as recruiters, but I'm sure many people viewing hear this a lot from the initial person that they may approach. That look, you're not on our vendor panel. Being presented with a huge obstacle around that, and that we're not reviewing that for the next 12 months. This, that, and the other.
Yep.
Now, on the back of that, you hear a lot of persistent salespeople push through that, find a significant, problem or a differentiator in their product to bypass procurement or to be sponsored up.
Yep.
If a salesperson's to listen to this each time and back away early on in the process, I could see a lot of salespeople walking away from a lot of opportunities that could potentially their competitors that may be more persistent or innovative find a way in. So how does a salesperson themselves know the difference between a supplier that's just giving you the line to get rid of you and one that genuinely is going to have that roadblock 18 months down the track, as you say?
Look, I think that's part of what separates great salespeople from the also-rans.
Yeah.
And that is the ability to quickly work out whether or not you're a chance to find a path of least resistance in an account.
Yeah.
So you make a good point. Qualifying very quickly and upfront whether or not you have any way into the account is critical. So being able to strategically withdraw if you need to, or find a way, another angle in. You talk about the different military type strategies, frontal attack, flanking to the side, and all that kind of thing. Yeah. When I did TAS planning years ago, we talked about all these different strategies. Yeah. And at the end of the day, as a salesperson, you may have to go and actually align yourself with one of the tier ones, an IBM or a HP in the technology space. In other industries, it might be one of the bigger players. Yeah. In order to sell to the end user, you might need to go in via a different channel. Yeah, that's the way it is now.
Fair enough. Yeah. In your keynote, you spoke a lot about, historical sales process was very much a push model.
Yes.
Outbound, using the phone, and look, I'm sure a lot of the people watching here today are still in that mode.
Yep.
And for them, it may well still be quite effective as well. Yep. But obviously, more and more, the buyer has the information that they need at the disposal.
Yep.
They don't need a salesperson to educate them on what they could otherwise learn online. And often, as I think you say, the buyer is as informed and sometimes more informed on what's available to them than the salesperson themselves. So with that, you've spoken a lot about, the buying journey rather than the selling journey, and us mapping organisationally the sales process and the marketing process more so to the buying journey, and having salespeople get involved at the latter process and not so much at the earlier, and nurturing that client through a marketing funnel.
Yes.
So and you spoke a lot about what organisations can do to improve that process to capture more of the market.
Yep.
But as a salesperson, which is a lot of the people that are listening,
if
they're a sales leader or perhaps even more so a salesperson, that gives you a disabling feeling that so much of our success as salespeople is being determined before we've got the opportunity to integrate with the customer.
Yep.
Are salespeople becoming irrelevant? How do we stay relevant? And perhaps more so, how do we make an impact on our number if so much is out of our control and reliant upon the organisation getting its, I guess, methodology together around that sales process.
Well, look, there's a lot of questions in there.
There is.
So I'll try and address all of them if I can. You're right what you said right up front there about information parity being the big change. So when buyers change how they buy, sellers have to change how they sell.
Yeah.
Right throughout history, it's been buyers' tastes and preferences that drives markets.
Yeah.
So now the buyer is fully informed, they've got high expectations, and they can demand a totally different service. So you're right, push selling is 20th century, it's finished.
Yep.
We don't push a buyer through a sales process any longer. So it's all about customer-led or customer pull. And in that scenario, you've got to be very clear about how you map the buying journey. I talked during the keynote, as you know, about the fact that the really savvy vendors these days map the buying journey. They understand at each point of the buying journey what the trigger events are that might take a buyer from status quo into awareness, and from awareness into consideration and through to purchase. Ultimately, what we're trying to do is get them through to the first purchase, but then, through to loyalty, repeat business, customer advocacy. That's the ultimate aim. And to do that, you've got to understand what are the trigger events. You've got to look at what the messaging, buying stage appropriate messaging is along the way. You look at the tools as well, what tools are used at each of those stages in the buying journey.
Yep.
And then you map all of the touch points. Once you do that, and I'm doing that every week now with clients. Once you do that exercise, you start to say, this is not a sales process anymore. What we're doing is just creating a buying aligned process so that the vendor can follow the buyer and educate and help the buyer. We're no longer selling, we're actually just educating. I think David Meerman Scott said it beautifully when he said, you sell more when you stop selling.
Sure.
So I think that's where the savvy vendors are going. People like HubSpot, Salesforce, some of those sorts of organisations are doing that very well now.
So from that point of view, is it really up to the organisation to be successful as a sales unit rather than down to the individual being able to impact on that sales result? And I guess that's my question is where everything you've spoken about there to me sounds like it can be impacted by the organisation, not the salesperson that works for the organisation.
Yes.
So where does the salesperson come in to the future when it comes to sales effectiveness and what can salespeople be doing? Or do we throw methodology out the window and just focus on the customer and helping educate them when we're selling to them?
Look, that's a key point, and I write about that in the book.
Yeah.
The poor old salesperson is doing what they're told in many cases.
Yeah.
They've got KPIs and measurements that they're adhering to, depending on the business.
Yeah.
And more often than not, it's still, unfortunately, in that old push style where, volume metrics, how many calls have you made, how many meetings you've got, is your pipeline 3 to 5 times quota, all of those old-fashioned kind of measurements.
Yeah.
So, to your question, if the organisation from the top down doesn't recognise that we need to change the way we go to market, then the salesperson will be forced, whether they like it or not, to keep behaving the same way they always have.
Yeah.
And so I've got a fairly bleak view of the future for what I call the generalist salesperson. If you're just a generalist, in other words, a walking brochure, and the buyer's already got the information at hand, at their fingertips, what value are you adding to the buyer?
Sure.
And therefore, why would the buyer spend their time talking to you? And clearly now they don't. So the key point here is that for salespeople, they've got to specialise. Okay. And when they specialise in whatever area, they become valuable. They can bring commercial insights. They can open with a narrative that captures the buyer's attention, and if they can carry that narrative through, then they're adding real value.
Yeah. Okay.
Yeah.
And it's interesting because I find when people are telling stories about what's going on with other clients is perhaps the most powerful narrative, because you can't get that from a brochure.
No.
Other people in your industry are doing X to get a competitive advantage.
Yep.
That customer's going to want to talk to you. What are my competitors doing without giving away anything confidential? What are my competitors doing?
Yep.
At the very least, I want to work that out. Even if I've got no interest in buying your product, I should be interested in that, shouldn't I?
100%.
As a buyer.
100%. You're right. Storytelling is, everyone's talking about the importance of storytelling.
Yeah.
The really great salespeople in this day and age and moving forward will be specialised, and they'll be capable of very quickly and succinctly rolling out a story that's relevant and personalised to their target customer.
So I guess, so much of us, and we did this with Tony Hughes when he was the keynote a couple of months ago at the Sales Masterminds.
Yep.
We all turned around to each other and Tony asked us to give a 1 minute narrative on what we do. And each of us at the table went on to talk about us.
Yes.
And me and our product. And that's the brochure selling, isn't it?
It is.
And so much of us, I noticed at that event, are still in that mode where it really needs to be about them, what's going on in their space.
Yep.
And that's where being a specialist becomes handy, right? Because you're able to perhaps not just be a specialist in a product area, but in a market segment, so you can speak to what's going on in that market and lead with education.
Yes.
And perhaps challenging in some environments. You're doing it this way, well, here's what best practice looks like.
Yeah.
How's that going for you? Because your competitors are experiencing this.
Yep.
Let me show you how they're doing it.
Yes.
100%. That's going to get the attention, but that's where the salesperson remains relevant.
100%.
Yeah.
Yep. 100%. Look, what you're talking about there with the 1 minute exercise is, they're bad habits and they're hard to break.
Yeah.
But the really smart guys and savvy vendors these days are doing exactly what you said. They're tipping the whole thing on its head.
Yep.
They're coming at it from the buyer perspective. They're educating. They're helping. I was told in my very first week of sales, I think I started in 1989.
Yeah.
My first job. I was told always be closing. The ABC of selling, always be closing, and that denotes pushing your buyer through. Pushing them to buy something when they're not quite ready. Now it's all about always be helping. So we've gone from ABC to ABH.
Well, it's interesting. At the event, you spoke about having received a sales call from the guys at HubSpot after you downloaded a white paper and they were mapping your buying journey, obviously, identify where you were.
Yep.
What did you say about the salesperson that gave you a call? I can't remember the gentleman's name.
Yes.
But your initial impression?
Yeah, look, that was fascinating to me as a long-term salesperson
Yeah.
with all of those bad habits that we just talked about.
Yeah.
I took my sales cap off and I became a buyer. So for my business, I was looking at marketing automation. I'd heard about HubSpot, downloaded a white paper, as you said, and I got a phone call from a gentleman named Jack Doran the next day. And Jack's an inbound marketing specialist.
Okay.
And the phone call was really refreshing. It was Jack's basically just educating me about inbound marketing. I didn't know a lot about it, but there was nothing sales about that call.
Okay.
He didn't ask for a compelling event. He wasn't after budget. He didn't want to know the time frames. He was just helping me understand about inbound marketing, and it was really refreshing. And what subsequently happened in the following months is that model continued where HubSpot was just interested in educating me as a buyer and taking me on their journey.
Yeah.
And it was there was no push selling, there was no uncomfortable feeling like I'm being sold to. It was just a really smart and look, that's the model for the future.
Okay. So naturally, because he wasn't closing you, you didn't sign up.
I did sign up.
Oh, you did sign up.
Yeah.
Okay, so it works.
It absolutely works.
Yeah, sure. Okay.
No, he led me very nicely to a natural conclusion, and I often say to my clients, the sale is what happens when you are immersed in helping your buyer.
Sure.
So if you just do all those things the way you should, the sale comes naturally at the end anyway.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. And I think for salespeople, one of the challenges is they want to do that, and I think the better ones are definitely doing it. But then the numbers are still being crunched with regard to their targets. That's not going to stop anytime soon in reality. Organisations, need that commercial outcome and salespeople need to justify their position. So I guess with that, the salesperson wants to focus on quality and focus on the customer. I'm finding that often it's coming at the cost of numbers though. So it needs to be a balancing act still, doesn't it, in terms of having the right number of customers, because you can educate one customer and play that perfectly, but they just may not buy, and because they may not have budget, whatever it might be. What are you seeing going on with your customers around balancing between the numbers game and following the right methodology?
Well, look, I've got a fairly black and white view of things. Okay. I think to your opening point there about how they're measured and managed, I don't believe that the future will allow an incongruous situation whereby salespeople are driven for revenue attainment when the buyer actually just wants an outcome. That's the basis of the embedded distrust that we have between the buyer and the salesperson.
Of interest, I guess.
Misalignment of interest.
Yep.
Salespeople, when they are measured solely on revenue attainment and quota and commissioned, that creates a misalignment. And everyone knows that. We all know that intuitively as buyers. We're all buyers.
Yeah.
So what I'm seeing now in some of the really savvy vendors that are moving away from commissions and also moving away from quota, they're realising that actually there's a whole range of other KPIs that can be put in place for salespeople that are aligned to the buyer. So things like not just customer sat and NPS scores, but things like lifetime customer value, retention rates, paying the salesperson on the second and third sale rather than the first.
Okay.
So, creating customer loyalty, creating repeat business, customer advocacy.
Yep.
These are the measurements that the really savvy vendors are now moving towards.
Yeah, and I guess the opportunity is definitely there now that they're in a software as a service model. They're paying by the month.
Yes.
So it's very easy for them for the likes of, let's say, a Salesforce, to draw alignment between remunerating or incentivizing that salesperson around the second or third, or retention of the customer,
yes,
because they continue to pay. Does that reign true in most industries that aren't, even if it's not software as a service? And so many industries are going towards that sort of model. But for those that aren't,
yep,
do you see that realistically that they can shift that focus from quota attainment and new business?
They can, and they have to.
Yeah, okay.
Because what I did for most of my career was, when I look back now, somewhat embarrassing.
Yeah.
We would sell software. We would say, there you go, Mr. Customer, there's the software. See you later. On to the next one. Those days are over. The ultimate aim is to provide the customer with the most delightful experience they can find,
yep,
so that they keep coming back to you. So whether you're a SaaS-based company on a consumption-based model, or you're still using the old perpetual license model or the upfront purchase, you have to create the right experience to keep that customer from going somewhere else.
Sure. The advocacy piece is more important than ever as well.
Oh, yeah.
Because, where before, happy customer would tell one person and an unhappy customer would tell 10. Now you've got that amplified with obviously
Social.
the digital age and social.
Yeah.
So that customer nurturing, customer experience model,
yep,
is more important than it's ever been.
Yeah, 100%. It's also, think about it logically, it's also the cheapest sale you'll ever make. When a buyer recommends, your product to someone else, and someone comes and says, I want that, that's the cheapest sales force you'll ever employ.
Yeah. Look, we get a lot of inbound leads here at Harlow Group, people calling us, wanting some help with, building out their sales force. Or just finding that key member that's going to go out there and generate revenue or what have you.
Yep.
And, the thing we've found that's helped us to do that more than we'd experienced prior was getting our customers to advocate for us on video.
Yep.
And if you're on our website now, go to the front page of the website, and the video is all you'll see, because that's what we want people to see. It's what our clients are saying about us. And if you can create that elevated experience, which is certainly our focus, we've found it pay us back in droves. Because, as you say, it's the cheapest sale, and we need to look at cost of sale. There's a lot of effort that goes into what you're talking about, mapping the buyer journey and all those sorts of things.
Yep.
It's a lot of time and effort that goes into getting on the phone and prospecting.
Yep.
If you can just have the phone ring and they're ready to buy because they've seen what other customers have to say, it's powerful stuff, isn't it?
Look, if you can lower the cost of customer acquisition, that's what everyone's driving to these days.
Yeah.
So, a CFO will look at two measurements: cost of customer acquisition, or cost of sale, and lifetime customer value. There should be a 3-to-1 ratio. In order to be really profitable and be able to continue to invest in your business, that's the sort of things you need to look at. And if you take Atlassian as an example,
okay,
$320 million worth of software last year they sold, Australian-based software company, with no salespeople and a very, very low cost of customer acquisition. Now, of course, not everybody can do that.
Sure.
But what they're
doing... self-serve sort of model, I presume.
Self-serve, yep. They sell a lot of their products from their website, etc. But what they're doing is creating a very high margin business that allows them to keep reinvesting in innovation, product roadmaps and ongoing development that keeps them ahead of the pack. So that's where we're driving towards.
It's interesting, isn't it? Because with spin selling, challenger sale, target account selling, all these methodologies,
yep,
there's a push towards becoming more consultative and more involved in the customer. That example there you've spoken about is the opposite. It's transactional in the sense that the customer's self-serving. And what I'm noticing is the most successful organisations, in a lot of ways, are enabling the customer to buy easier, get the information easier. So in the end, sometimes it's just a transaction in the sense that you don't need a salesperson nurturing you through multi-stakeholder management, identifying problems or creating problems to solve, and that complexity. Sometimes when you peel it all away and make it simpler and take them on that marketing journey or what have you, the sales at the end can be much simpler, can't it? And that's scalable.
That is scalable. And look, at the end of the day, buyers don't always have time. If it's just a transactional, as you say, commodity-based product that they're after, a solution to a problem, and they can get that online quick, they don't need to pick up the phone and talk to a sales guy who they know, again, has a vested interest, then that self-service model creates the perfect customer experience. Now, that's not always the way. Sometimes a buyer still wants to talk to somebody, but more often than not, when you look at where we're going with artificial intelligence, cognitive computing, machine learning, virtual augmented reality, the Internet of Things, more and more buyers will self-serve.
Well, what I'm noticing is organisationally, the best organisations are creating a scenario where the customer's so educated by the time they're speaking to the salesperson. 80% of their decisions are made and they're speaking to a salesperson to confirm what they already know. And that's where I'm seeing sales in some instances, and actually with the more successful companies, is actually starting to become more transactional.
100%.
But it's because the marketing journey they've gone on till that point, or the buying journey with the marketing department, has educated them up until that point. And they've gone and compared all the different products. Perhaps they've even done free trials and seen demos that they can see pre-recorded online without a salesperson involved. All this is going on, and I guess that comes back to the point of where are we as a sales profession, and is the profession diminishing? And naturally, unless at the end of that process you can add further value, or potentially find a way to navigate your way in earlier in the process to accelerate that buying journey to be faster because you've shown them an opportunity that they could seize, that perhaps their competitors are, or other companies in the industry are, or your last customer did. To accelerate that process, you need to be doing one of the two to be remaining relevant, by the sounds of it.
100%. Look, whether you believe CEB or whoever it is that's saying now that buyers are 60% to 80% of the way through the buying journey before they speak to a salesperson, regardless of whether you believe that or not, it's happening.
There's no doubt it's true.
We're all better educated. Case in point, I just bought a car recently. And like everybody these days, I did all the research online. I walked into the dealership right at the end of the process and I said, I want this car, make, model, accessories, give us your best price. So poor old sales guy is copying that all the time now. And that's the model. That's the
transactional model we spoke about. Unfortunately, they're commoditized in that environment, because you can go to another dealer and buy it at a cheaper price and play them off against one another. So remaining relevant through differentiation, if you can as an organisation, is key. Don't admire the car dealers where they've got another dealer down the road selling the same car. But the other thing that's costing organisations enormous amounts in opportunity from a sales point of view, you spoke about at the event, is turnover of salespeople. And there's obviously a lot going on by way of failing salespeople, churning every 12 to 18 months. Not reaching their quota. So I think there's a problem there around creating success for salespeople. And then there's another issue around perhaps different generations wanting to experience different things earlier. They'll talk about the millennials wanting to move on within 2 or 3 years, and so the opportunity cost is huge. You went through some numbers at the event. Do you mind sort of sharing, what the cost is, and perhaps we can get onto what the solution is as well?
Yeah, absolutely. Look, I write extensively about this particular topic in the book. When you look at the context that we're all competing in now as salespeople, the stuff that we've just talked about, we're seeing more and more underperformance. In other words, people that are failing to meet or exceed their quota. And that number, depending on, again, which analyst you believe, that number's well above 50%. Some say it's 75%, some say it's 63%. But certainly we're seeing more and more salespeople not getting their quotas. Now, someone at the event sort of semi-jokingly said, that's because quotas are set way too high. And there's an element of that in that as well. But when you look at underperformance and how that translates into sales staff turnover, the average sales tenure for a B2B salesperson now is 16.8 months. Now think about this. It takes on average 7 months to onboard and train a salesperson to get them to maximum productivity. Then you've got them leaving at 16.8 months. So they've got 10 months to create a return. That's just not sustainable. In fact, it's ridiculous. There was a study that was done out of the US that showed or highlighted that every time that happens, the cost to the business for separation cost, rehiring, retraining is about $148,000 Australian. But that doesn't factor into all of those costs that I talked about during the keynote, which is while that salesperson's disengaged, either decided I'm moving on, I'm going to go to a new job, or being managed out, there's a period of some months, I would say 3 to 5 months, where that person has disengaged. While they're disengaged, the territory's underserved. While the territory's underserved, the competitors are coming in and picking up the customers. So when you look at that and that downswing in the territory for that period, if you add up all of those costs, some are saying that can be as expensive as $1 million. And I wouldn't be surprised if that's understating it.
Well, if the budget's $2 million and they've been unproductive for an entire year, well, it's $2 million.
So look at that. Forget the sales guy for a second. Let's talk about the territory. If that salesperson's been 3 months disengaged and then they're gone, turnover happens here, then there's another 3 to 6 months before you find someone to fill the role, re-recruiting. Then there's that 7 months that I talked about to get them up to speed. That's 16 months.
And look, it's a problem we obviously encounter a lot with organisations.
You're right,
and as we're taking on a vacancy, we're asking, why did the last salesperson fail? If that's in fact the case, and if that's why we're recruiting, and there's 2 reasons why that keep on coming up. There's a theme around that. It's either that they're the sales leader, and this is interesting in line with the inbound marketing conversation we're having. But the sales leader's feeling is that they're not playing the numbers game with prospecting, and they're not meeting enough customers. So that's the single most common reason we're told. And the second is that they're not got the commercial acumen to have a business conversation that uncovers real needs and challenges the customer. So a lack of that challenger sales profile. But so that's often why the sales leaders are perceiving that their salespeople are not working out. There may be a number of organisational issues if it's happening repetitively. So I ask them, is that happening repetitively within your organisation? Because then they need to look at themselves, don't they? And look, there's so many challenges with getting the right salesperson, but I think if an organisation is going to come on board with the inbound concept rather than the push concept of selling, the ability to get their people to succeed, these organisations that do that well, the success rate's much higher than 60% of their salespeople, isn't it?
It is. And look, I get annoyed about this, Steve. I feel for salespeople and I feel for sales leaders to some extent as well, but if you're a salesperson that's being driven like it was still 1990, volume metrics on quota and, number of meetings, number of calls you've made during the day, then you're on a hiding to nothing to some extent. So I feel for those people. That's only going to lead to underperformance because buyers don't want to buy that way anymore. They can't be bothered being interrupted. They don't want some sales guy pushing them. So, I think what you touched on there with creating the inbound, again, the savvy businesses these days are spending a lot more time focusing on content marketing, social and digital, developing systems that can scale to create the inbound to support the salespeople to be successful. And if you're not doing some of that, you're in trouble now.
Yeah, it's an interesting one because the sales leader will point to their top performers and say, well, they can do it. And in a lot of instances, they're 200% of target. So it's certainly feasible. And these are people that have a hell of a lot of drive and hunger. And that is the minority of the sales community, and that's why you have those top sort of 20% performers that our clients are consistently asking us for. And that's what we're really honing in on when we're recruiting, is that drive and that, burning fire, so as we can find that top 20%. But that's all well and good for the top 20%. If you're looking at organisational sales performance, you need to look deeper than, how do we get the middle up? How do we make sure that bottom 30, 40% that's dropping off every 12 to 18 months, how do we get a larger proportion of them to the middle? So as an organisation, we're performing effectively, because finding the top 20% performers, making them 100% of your team, you'd want to have a pretty big budget in your salary cap in order to maintain having top 20% performers across your whole team, I would imagine.
Look, the clients that I deal with that are successful are doing everything we've just talked about, but to your point, in terms of creating a high-performance sales culture, it's all about range management. How do you get your A and B players to continue performing the way they are, but bringing up the C and D players, and meeting them in the middle? So, look, it's a challenge. It's always a challenge. But as Peter Drucker said many years ago, culture eats strategy for breakfast. And that's why I talked during the session about the importance of creating the right culture. This culture of constant turnover, and I mean, think about what that does to the buyer. The buyer's dealing with a revolving door of salespeople, and pretty soon that impacts your brand and your company. So it's crazy. We have to stop it.
And that's, we're talking about failing salespeople turning over. The top performers are turning over too, though. And so the interesting thing I see is sales leaders go to the squeakiest wheel.
Yep.
And my top 20% performers are doing great. So let them go.
Yep.
Right, you guys are struggling. I'll be coaching over here and developing over here. Meanwhile, top performer's not learning. Top performer isn't seeing any career progression. They're just being asked to do their number again quarter on quarter.
Yep.
And eventually their steam runs out. That fire that we spoke about, doing the same thing quarter in, quarter out, burns out, and they look for a new challenge. So we're noticing the top performers are turning over too. So it's turning over at both ends. And so, we did a survey not too long ago of top sales performers and why they leave jobs.
Right.
And there's two reasons. The first one is simply that they didn't see where the next step was, didn't understand what that next step is, and didn't feel like they were being invested in from a developmental point of view.
Yep.
I think when people are learning, they're interested and they're motivated.
Correct.
And so that wasn't a surprise. And the second reason was change.
Yep.
So when organisations change the goalposts or management shifts or there's a buyout,
Yep.
they signed up for one thing, now it's different, I'm moving on. So that's harder to control. But certainly that first one, do you see that going on a lot with your clients, the top performers sort of still moving on themselves?
Well, they do, and look, you've got to step back and zoom out occasionally. I call it zooming out and looking at the broader environment. And the truth is that, the sort of business velocity that's going on now, product life cycles are going like this. Sales cycles are getting longer because more and more buyers are risk averse and they don't want to make a decision. So we've got consensus buying. CEB said 6.8 buyers per decision nowadays. So, even your top performers are dealing with this accelerated rate of change. Industries spring up overnight and then they're gone tomorrow. So there is naturally going to be a fair amount of shifting and whatnot going on. And it's part of the reason why I set up Sales Tribe, frankly, is that, there's a lot of salespeople out there looking to do, short-term contracts and short-term engagements and that kind of thing.
Okay.
So, there's definitely a move towards that kind of turnover as a natural evolution of business.
Okay. Well, look, once again, Graham has authored The Future of the Sales Profession. Get your hands on this. Graham's got a lot of great ideas around how we can all survive and thrive in the new age of selling. Thanks again for your time today, Graham. It's been great speaking with you.
Appreciate it, Steve.
Look forward to speaking to you again soon.
Thanks very much. Good on you.